From August 1989 to September 1990, 2 young Australian women lived with the Burmese Student Army. They documented their stay in Burma with a Video 8 camera. This is their story.
Well, I was studying photography for 2.5 years, and when I finished that, I really needed something to do. It was getting frustrating finding work here, and I really wanted to do photojournalistic work rather than something like fashion or advertising, and it was really hard to find here. Lyndal and I had arranged to meet in Bangkok, and it was there that we heard stories about a group of students who were living on the border between Thailand and Burma. They'd fled Burma because of what had happened during a military coup in 1988. So we decided to go up there for the weekend, but we ended up staying on the border for over a year. The people we'd met had been shot at, imprisoned and tortured by their own military government. They were desperate to tell the world what was happening in Burma, and we wanted to help.
2 tickets to Sydney.
We were on the border of Thailand and Burma in an area called the Liberated Zone. It's a military area held by the Burmese ethnic groups. These people have been fighting the Burmese military for independence for over 40 years. Because we were taking a video camera into a war zone, I kept thinking I should feel a sense of danger. But to be honest, I felt excited. I felt like this trip was going to be a real personal test.
It was also my first trip to the Burmese border, but I'd been inside Burma before. I'd been to Rangoon and Mandalay in 1985. I didn't know much about Burmese politics then. In fact, I didn't really know much about Burma at all. I knew that it was a Buddhist country and that the Allied forces had fought there in World War II. My grandmother used to tell us stories about her brother who disappeared as a POW building the Burma Railway. So I decided to take my Super 8 camera with me to film and find his grave. One of the most surprising things about arriving in Burma was that it was like the clock had stopped in 1940. I tried to imagine what it was like for my great-uncle in World War II. It just seemed miles away from any war movie I'd seen on television.
It is amongst our bitterest memories of war that free-born Australians, taken prisoner when Malaya fell, were treated like slaves. Like work beasts, they were driven to toil in the tropical sun. Men died like flies. Not only Australians, but 18,000 white men in all, and more than 70,000 other races. They say a man died for every sleeper laid along this track.
I went to the World War II cemetery, but it was huge. I walked up and down the rows looking for Private Jim Ryan, but I couldn't find his grave. There were lots of unidentified soldiers, so I filmed one of their graves instead. I got on a local bus back to Rangoon, but when it was stopped at a military checkpoint, I got pulled off. The senior officer tried to question me in Burmese. He kept asking about the Karen. I realise now he was asking me about one of the so-called rebel groups up on the border. But at the time, I didn't know what he was talking about. Then they put me on a military truck and said I had to leave Burma. Standing at the Karen checkpoint reminded me of the experience I had in 1985. In the end, all that happened to me was that I was thrown out of Burma. But that experience made me really want to find out what was happening in this country and why there were university students living in camps all along the border.
It was an early hour especially chosen by Burmese astrologers to mark Burma's full assumption of independence. In place of the Union Jack, the Burmese national flag was hoisted with all due ceremony. It's a tragedy for Burma that Aung San, who worked so hard for this day, didn't live to see the Burmese flag flying over Rangoon. During the war, Aung San convinced the Burmese people to support the Japanese in exchange for a promise of independence. It wasn't long before he lost faith in the Japanese, and Burma's army joined the Allied forces. Aung San's shifting allegiance was forgiven, and his commitment to Burma was acknowledged as he represented the Burmese people in independence negotiations with the British cabinet at 10 Downing Street. Then, only months later, disaster struck. Aung San and many of the country's new leaders were ruthlessly gunned down at a cabinet meeting. If anyone could have assured a smooth and united path to democracy, it was this young leader.
As we found out more about the history of Burma, I realised how frustrating the struggle for democracy must have been for the Burmese people. Some of the most shocking things that happened there in the last 50 years, and it just felt like no one knew anything about it.
This is Lloyd Williams reporting from Burma. After 14 years of a teetering democracy, the Burmese armies seized control of the country today in what is claimed to be a bloodless coup. General Ne Win said the army had been forced to act because of the steadily deteriorating economic and political situation. Ne Win has been commander of the Burmese army since 1948. For a decade, he's been the most powerful man in Burmese politics. Although the general seems in a strong position now, observers in Rangoon believe the situation may still be unstable.
At first I thought the student camps would be really like refugee camps. Everyone's starving, really poor conditions and generally depressing. But it wasn't, it was more like a holiday camp. It was hard for me to believe that there were stories of hardship behind so many smiling faces. But that feeling soon changed when we started finding out what really happened in Burma in 1988.
In the Burmese capital Rangoon, anti-government protests continue to escalate. The demonstrations are led by students carrying portraits of General Aung San, the hero of Burmese independence. For 4 months now, the students have been calling for an end to Burma's repressive one-party system and for the resignation of military ruler Ne Win. Once one of Asia's richest countries, Burma has been reduced to grinding poverty by General Ne Win's economic policy, known as the Burmese Road to Socialism. Student leaders vow to continue the protest until their demands for economic and political reforms are met.
In a surprise announcement, General Ne Win has resigned as leader of the party that has ruled Burma for the last 26 years. However, student leaders claim that he's still pulling the strings. The new government has promised democratic elections, but the students say they don't believe these pledges and that their protests will continue until an election date is announced.
Although the students had fled to the border, they were far from victims. As we recorded their stories, we felt an incredible empathy with them. The reality is that they're university and school students, the same age as us and with similar backgrounds.
Before the democracy marches, I attended school regularly. There was nothing to worry about. My father was a public servant, and we weren't in want of money, and I didn't have to work. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We were middle class, like most people. I never had strong feelings for or against the military government, although I was aware of what was going on.
One day we were sitting in a tea shop near the traffic lights, and an army vehicle stopped, and these soldiers jumped off from it. We couldn't run anywhere. They called us out. I went out, but there was a young Muslim boy who was terrified, and he started to run. One of the soldiers shot him with a rifle. The boy fell on the road. He wasn't dead yet. He was moaning and clutching his stomach. And then the sergeant finished him off by shooting him in the temple point blank. And then the soldiers lifted his body and threw him over the edge of the sports oval where the bushes were. And the army car left.
Yesterday, anti-government protests continued throughout Burma. The government has responded with the imposition of martial law, and tourists report dozens of army trucks and soldiers moving towards the city centre.
Soldiers killed 3 nurses at this spot outside Rangoon Hospital on Wednesday afternoon. The killings follow a week of indiscriminate shooting by the Burmese military, resulting in hundreds of deaths. Another government leader has been forced to resign because of the continuing student protests. Latest pictures from the Burmese capital show university students rejoicing as members of the armed forces join in demonstrations calling for democratic elections. Student leaders are optimistic about this new development.
After a month of massive demonstrations in Rangoon, General Saw Mong has seized power in a military coup. However, experts say that General Saw Mong and other senior army officers still remain loyal to long-term ruler General Ne Win. The fate of emerging opposition leaders isn't yet known, but only yesterday, a new political spokesperson, Aung San Suu Kyi, called for the army to stay out of politics.
Split up. We want the armed forces to keep together, but to keep out of politics.
Observers fear that the campaign for democracy could end in even more bloodshed.
I live in Taketa. The military had blocked the roads, so no one was allowed into the city. There were soldiers waiting at all the blockades. There's a bridge, Thanawara Bridge, and our demonstration crowd were coming through that way. There were young children in front. They said to the soldiers, "Please let us pass," and the soldier nodded his head. After they'd taken 2 or 3 steps, the soldiers started shooting at the school children who were holding pictures and posters of General Aung San. About 10 people were killed, and the rest of the crowd came running back. We had to leave the bodies there.
We were marching around the streets. The smaller children from the primary schools were in the front. They were holding flags. The army shot at them, and a child holding a flag fell. Another student caught hold of the flag so it wouldn't fall. The flag kept changing hands, like that, as the army kept shooting at the person holding it. Finally, a child holding the flag ran away.
We saw people getting killed, but we got away and reassembled the protest march. When we got to Bahan, the army was there and surrounded us from left and right. Some of the children didn't know where to run, so they ran into the Royal Lake, and about 50 of them drowned in the lake.
These pictures, taken after last week's coup, show the army using force to put down demonstrations. The anti-government protesters, men, women and children, had to take cover as soldiers fired indiscriminately into a march on the American embassy. As people cowered hopelessly, more shots rang out and another man was wounded. The Burmese military government maintains that the death toll was low. Mr. Ong Jaw, Director General of the Political Department of the Foreign Affairs Ministry.
The demonstrators, there were about 20, but 525 looters. 525 looters.
The injured were carried to safety in a hail of bullets, with the soldiers determined to put down all opposition to military rule, apparently firing at anyone that moved. Opposition sources claim that the number of people killed in the street fighting is close to 1,000.
I'd always taken the freedom to demonstrate for granted, but the Burmese people have had that right taken away from them. So when we got back to Australia, we contacted the Burmese community here to see if we could get involved with their activities. And most of those people had escaped from Burma after the 1962 coup because of the oppression of the government. And they were still actively protesting for democracy in Burma.
I happen to have been studying at Yangon University as a young student in 1962. And the first student resistance happened only 4 months after the coup. That was in July. I can still remember that. We were just protesting against the regimental style of the hostile rule on the university campus. And all of a sudden, without any warning being given, they shot us with automatic rifles, automatic guns, which had claimed the lives of over 200 students. So because of the tradition of the student involvement in the resistance, the students are always in the forefront of casualties.
Every Burmese person we've ever met has had a shocking experience at the hands of the Burmese military. And we wanted to travel along the border to document as many of these stories as possible. So the camp commander assigned Lambois as our bodyguard to help us move between the different camps. For the next 10 months, we went up and down the border, hearing hundreds of horror stories about the Burmese military and what they'd done. It seemed like no one was exempt from the Burmese military. But for me, it was really the stories of the people arrested and tortured that really got to me.
First, they asked us to ride a motorcycle. They asked us to ride like this on our tippy toes. After a while, the toes started trembling and shaking. When we started shaking, they hit us with cycle tires and kicked us. We also have to make noises like boom, 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 continuously until they got what they wanted. We have to go like this for hours. Sometimes we put our heels down to rest our legs. If we do that, they hit us. If we start to tremble, they hit us.
Another time they brought stones and put them in front of me. I had to kneel on these stones for a long time. Kneel like this. Yeah? On sharp stones, stones like these. I had to stay like these for hours. Under these conditions in the prisons, you are beaten down. Your pride and your self-esteem are beaten down.
I can't remember how many times we were taken out and beaten. We kept collapsing and falling down.